Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time we're going across the globe to Japan to explore how grief and care are kind of changing. We've got these really interesting excerpts from a Japanese text all about grief counseling.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I think it's going to really kind of make us rethink some
I
things.
think you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really changes some of our Western assumptions.
Yeah, for sure. But right away, it's clear that this isn't just talking about, like, dealing with death, when a loved one dies.
Yeah,
This is a much broader look at things.
yeah, it is. It actually defines grief as any big upheaval in life or big emotional distress. So it covers things like divorce, job loss,
Wow.
even losing a pet.
That's really interesting. Makes you think maybe we've been a bit too narrow in how we think about grief, right?
Yeah.
Like maybe we need to acknowledge that even these smaller losses can really hit us hard.
It's true. It really highlights how everything's connected, our emotional well-being. The text even argues that anything that disrupts like how you see yourself or your place in the world, well, that can trigger a grief response.
Hmm. That's a good point. And, it's especially relevant when you think about all the huge social changes happening in Japan right now.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, the text talks about a society that's aging super fast. Families are getting smaller. More people are living alone.
It is. It's pretty striking. By 2025, 1 in 5 people in Japan are going to be over 75, and the death rate's been higher than the birth rate for over 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Those are some major shifts. And, I mean, that has to have a big impact on how people deal with loss, right?
Oh, definitely. Traditionally, Japanese society's always leaned really heavily on family and community support to help people through tough times.
Right.
But, as families shrink and they spread out geographically, those traditional networks, well, they start to break down.
That makes you think, what about your own support system? Like if something big happened to you, a huge life change or you experienced a loss, would the people in your life be there for you?
Yeah, it's a question we should all ask ourselves.
Absolutely.
Because in today's world, we can't always depend on having that traditional support in
Yeah.
the same way we used to do.
Yeah. And that's where I think this concept of grief care comes in. It's getting a lot of attention in Japan.
I've heard of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it really represents a new way of thinking about grief and loss.
It does. Grief care isn't about those quick fixes or, saying things like time heal all wounds. It's about creating a space for people to process what they're feeling and work through their grief.
So it's not about trying to fix it.
Right.
It's more about understanding
It is.
and empathy and really listening.
Yeah. Being there with them in their pain, without judging or having expectations.
Right. And realizing that everyone grieves differently.
Hmm.
There's no right or wrong way.
Exactly. Everyone's journey is unique.
One thing I found really interesting was this idea of having a grief care counselor in every family.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it sounds radical, right? But it shows how important they think it is to have more support and understanding out there.
I think it's less about having a professional in every family.
Oh,
It's more about, learning those skills like empathy and active listening.
got it. So it's more about building a culture of care where everyone feels comfortable sharing what they're going through.
Exactly. Supporting each other through
Yeah.
these tough times.
I love that. And, this text also talks about how technology has its limits when it comes to giving that kind of support.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, there's a really powerful line in it that says, a computer can't move a person's heart.
That's beautiful.
Isn't it? It's a reminder that even though technology can connect us in so many ways, it can't replace the human connection,
Right.
the warmth and the
You
understanding.
can't get a hug from a computer.
Exactly. So when we're dealing with grief, what we really need is to just be there for each other, right? To offer comfort and understanding without trying to fix everything.
Absolutely. Just being present.
Yeah.
That's what matters less.
I agree. It's like they're saying we need to build that support,
Yeah.
that understanding
Absolutely.
before the loss even happens.
Exactly. It's all part of grief care, building that culture of support and understanding before you even need it.
So it's like we're creating a more compassionate society.
Yes, a more resilient one, too.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's where the grief care counselor in every family idea fits in. But it's not about job titles or anything, like we were saying.
Yeah, it's about...
It's about fostering these essential skills.
Right.
Empathy, active listening.
Within families and communities.
Exactly. So people can be there for each other because everyone at some point is
Yeah.
going to experience grief and loss in their lives.
It's like a safety net.
Yeah, safety net of compassion,
Yeah.
understanding.
I like that a lot. And, that also connects with what the text says about the limits of technology.
Oh, yeah.
especially when we're dealing with something as personal as grief.
Absolutely.
Remember that line, a computer can't move a person's heart?
Mm-hmm. It's so true. Technology can connect us
Yeah.
in so many ways,
Uh-huh.
but it can never replace that warmth,
Right.
that understanding that comes from human connection.
Yeah. So are they saying that we should just abandon technology?
I don't think it's about abandoning technology. It's
Okay.
about recognizing that it can't do everything.
Right.
You know, like when someone's grieving, you can't just send them a text message and expect that to be enough. It's
True.
about actually being there.
Okay. So being present,
Right, being present.
not trying to mix things
Exactly.
or offer these empty platitudes,
Uh,
and recognizing that grief, it's a journey,
yeah, it's a journey.
not like a destination you arrive at.
Not a destiny. There's no timeline for healing.
Right.
And everyone's going to go through it differently. The important thing is to create that space for them to go on that journey.
I see. And the text also mentions that those traditional sources of support, like extended families and close communities, they're becoming less common, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. In Japan especially, but it's a trend we're seeing all over the world, really.
Oh, wow.
As societies become more mobile and more people move to cities, those traditional support systems, well, they just aren't as strong as they used to be.
That's really interesting. So does that mean that we need to come up with new ways to support each other?
It does, yeah. We need to be more intentional, more proactive about grief care.
Okay, so proactive grief care.
Mm-hmm. Because grief is universal. Everyone experiences it.
It's true,
And we all have a responsibility to support each other through it.
regardless of how our societies are changing.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that grief, well, it's not always about death,
Right.
right? It can come from any kind of significant loss.
Or any big life change.
Yes, absolutely. Divorce, losing your job, even moving to a new place, these things can all trigger a grief response.
That makes sense. Like any time our life is disrupted in a major way.
Exactly.
So all those skills we've been talking about, like empathy and active listening, those are valuable no matter what kind of loss we're facing.
They are, yeah, they're essential life skills, really.
I like that, essential life skills. And speaking of, the text also talks about self-awareness being really important when it comes to dealing with grief.
Oh, yeah.
And they actually include this grief check test
Oh, wow.
to help people assess their emotional state.
Those kinds of self-assessment tools can be really helpful.
Yeah.
They can help us understand our own feelings,
Yeah.
and they can encourage us to seek support when we need it.
I remember when I first saw the grief check test.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was looking at some of the statements and I thought, wow, I felt exactly like that
Yeah, me too.
when I was going through that tough time.
It's so validating
It is, right?
to see your own experience reflected.
Yeah, it makes you feel less alone.
Exactly. And it gives you permission to say, hey, I'm not okay.
Right, and to ask for help without
Yeah.
feeling weak or anything.
Exactly.
So we've been talking about how important empathy is and active listening
Mm-hmm.
and human connection. And we talked about how traditional support systems are changing.
Yeah, and how we need to be more proactive
Right.
in creating support for each other.
And I think in the last part of our deep dive, it would be great to explore how these ideas can actually be put into practice.
I agree. Let's talk about how we can integrate these insights into our own lives,
Yeah.
our own communities.
I love that. Okay, so let's get into that next.
Sounds good.
Yeah, it's incredible how much we can learn from other cultures, even about something like grief, something that we all experience.
Yeah.
This look at how Japanese approach it has really got me thinking about how we can all do better. How can we be more supportive?
Yeah, I think it comes down to shifting our whole mindset. Instead of trying to fix grief, we need to learn to just be with it.
That's so true. And I think something else that was powerful in the text was that idea of creating a safe space, like a space where people can actually express their grief,
Absolutely.
without being judged.
It's so easy to just jump in, with advice.
Oh, I know.
Try to cheer someone up.
Yeah.
But what we really need is just to be heard.
Yeah, to be heard and understood.
Exactly. To just let them share those raw emotions.
Right.
Without minimizing it or, dismissing their experience.
Yeah. And it makes me think about how often we try to rush people through grief.
Oh, all the time.
Like, with them sayings, you'll get over it, or time heals all wounds. But those platitudes, they don't really help, do they?
I don't think so, no. It can make people feel like their grief isn't valid.
Right.
Or like they have to hide their emotions.
Yeah. That's why I think that emphasis on acknowledging the different stages of grief is so important, like the Japanese approach.
Right.
It reminds us that there's no one right way to grieve and that everyone will cope differently.
And the text actually highlights how those stages can manifest differently in each person.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, some people express their grief really openly, very emotionally, while others, they might internalize it or it comes out as physical
I
symptoms.
see. So it can really vary.
It does.
And it's not always straightforward either.
Right. We have to remember that grief isn't linear.
It's not.
No, people can move back and forth between stages, and that's totally normal.
Okay, so it's a process,
Yeah,
not just
process.
like a one-time thing.
Exactly. It takes time, and it's okay to not be okay for a while.
That's a really important reminder. And something else we need to remember, grief isn't always about death.
Right, we've talked about that.
Like it can come from any big loss.
Absolutely. Breakups, job loss, moving to a new city.
Really anything that feels like a big shift in your life.
Yeah, all of those things can trigger those feelings of grief.
So how do we take all of this, everything we've learned from this Japanese text,
Yeah.
and actually use it in our own lives?
Mm-hmm.
How can we be better at supporting the people in our lives when they're going through tough times?
Well, I think a big part of it is just being more mindful
Okay,
in our
mindful.
interactions.
Yeah.
Put your phone down, really listen to what the other person is saying.
Be present,
Yes, be present and try to understand their perspective.
even if it's different from ours.
Even if it's different from ours, it's about being that true friend,
Yeah,
a shoulder to cry on, someone who listens without judgment.
yeah. And sometimes it's about offering practical support too, right?
Absolutely. Like maybe you offer to cook a meal or help with childcare.
Yeah, little things like that.
Yeah, those small acts of kindness can go a long way.
I think so. What else should we do?
Educate ourselves, learn about grief and loss.
Oh, good idea.
There are so many resources out there, books, articles, support groups,
Podcasts.
podcasts, exactly. All these things can help us understand the grieving process. Yeah, and how to be more support.
And we don't have to be experts, right?
No, not at
To
all.
offer comfort and support.
Just being there,
Mhm.
acknowledging someone's pain, that's often enough.
And it's also okay to ask for help ourselves
Of course.
when we need it.
Absolutely. If you're feeling overwhelmed or you don't know how to help someone,
Yeah.
there's no shame in reaching out for guidance.
It's a sign of strength.
It is. It shows that you care.
Yeah. So what have we learned today? This deep dive into grief and care in Japan. I think for me, the biggest takeaway is that we can all be more compassionate. We can all be more supportive.
I agree.
It's about being present, listening with empathy,
Mm-hmm.
and understanding that grief is universal. It's something we all go through, and it deserves our respect.
Yeah. It's a good reminder that even when things are hard,
Hmm.
even when we face loss and change, there's always hope for healing.
Yeah.
And if we work together to create a more caring and supportive world, we can help each other through those tough times.
Absolutely. Well, this has been such a great conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today.
It was my pleasure.
And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep learning, and most importantly, keep connecting with each other. Until next time, keep diving deep.